out how to put shapes into the box. 15-month-old Braxton shows off his carpenter skills. And finally, Zach stuffs a Nerf ball into a cup and then intently tries to dig it out with a spoon. Kristen's genetic makeup, due to Down syndrome, has limited her rate of motor development. She developed more slowly than is typical, but her early experiences also had a profound effect. Because she had repeated surgeries to correct a heart defect, she lay on her back throughout her first 2 years. When finally she did move about, she did so by scooting instead of crawling. Today, Kristen's parents are teaching her to crawl and walk with the help of a walker. Love, involvement, attention, and rich stimulation are helping Kristen develop not just motorically, but in all respects.
So that's a really good example and contrast with the motor development of the last child. Kristen, I think, was the name, as compared to the other children who seem to have closer to average motor development. And I wanted to go back to one of the models I showed last week about how we think about development. So in the lifespan perspective. So here we've got Lerner's bioecological systems model. So essentially these children all have their own biology. So for example, Kristen there, her biology made it so her biological motor development was slower than some of the other children, or maybe not capable of everything that they were capable of. So that is going to, maybe her interaction with her parents is going to be different than other children. So that might also affect the school network. If there is supportive schools or doctors that are well trained, or the parents have good insurance and able to get better care for the child, these are protective factors that will lead to more likely positive outcomes, or more positive outcomes for Kristen than otherwise, as well as these children that seem to be developing closer to average. Same with them. If they have more of these protective factors, if they have better school or social networks, if their parents are able to be more involved, if their parents know how to parent well versus not, if the parents' work isn't too stressful, or they're not having to work 3 jobs or things like that, those will all be protective factors for the development of these children. So that's some examples of how this model works. And hopefully seeing these children in comparison can kind of bring that more into perspective, because when I put the picture up here and it's like, well, everything interacts with everything, it's kind of hard to see how that might be. But you might be able to see, well, if the parents have access to better networks of support in their community, the child's development will probably be better or faster or more positive than if they don't have access to those things in their community, or if the parents aren't able to be with and interact with the child as much, whether they're developing on average or like Kristen had Down syndrome. If they're not able to interact with the child as much, or be there to show and demonstrate, or help them develop the skills to walk, or things like that. And this continues on into childhood and adolescence with teaching socio-emotional skills and those kinds of things. So hopefully that these examples make this model make more sense, that these children are developing within a system. Like the children themselves are kind of a system. You can think of them that way. They're a system of different factors, different not context within the individual, different features of themselves. And then they're in a system that provides or does not provide things to them. And for me, an applied developmental psychologist, one of the things I like to do is try to figure out, well, how can we apply the world in a way that helps everybody develop optimally, is one of my focuses. All right, that's where we were. So we've talked about sensation and perception. Also, sorry, I forgot to start the recording at the beginning of class. So this is about now in 45 minutes into class. So that's unfortunate, but slides are there. Yeah, sorry about that. I need to try and I have an alarm set on my phone, but it didn't go off. So I must have accidentally turned it off. Probably over the weekend. I was like, no more alarms. I want to sleep in, which doesn't ever happen when your child's waking up at 5:30 every day. So perception is what we're interpreting about the environment. Sensation is the sensory data coming in. And we had a whole chapter on that. I think we can kind of skip over some of this. I want to talk about how we research it in infants, and because it's hard. With an adult, you can ask, well, is your vision blurry, or can you hear this sound and not this sound? Those kinds of things. But if you ask an infant that, they're not going to respond, right? They haven't learned the language, they can't speak yet. So a lot of research looks at the behaviors of infants. A lot of it looks specifically at what they pay attention to. So their eyes, it tracks their eyes in a lot of cases. And this is called the visual preference method. So you take two blocks, put them in front of the child. One's a teal and one's red. If they look more at the one that's red, you might be able to assume that they like the red more, or they're more interested in it, right? If you put a red and a slightly different red color and they don't seem to interact with either of them differently, you might say, well, maybe they don't see or perceive the difference in the colors. So if it's really close shades, and this is how we try to determine what can infants sense and what can they perceive. So one of the ways this is done is habituation and dishabituation. You present a stimulus, whether it be that red block, for a while to the child, and then so they've got the red block in front of them. Then you give them a new red block that's slightly different. Sorry. You give them the first red block. You wait till they get bored with it, so they're not paying attention to it anymore. You give them a new red block that's a slightly different color. If they can't see the difference between those two reds, they probably won't be interested in the novel stimuli. If they can tell that difference between the two shades of red, they might be more interested in that novel stimuli because it's a slightly different red. So this is habituation, dishabituation. They get habituated, they get bored of the one, and so you present a new stimulus. You can do this with sounds. So you're playing one type of music, then you start playing another similar type of music, see if they can tell the different tones. Maybe if you're trying to see how high or low they can hear, you do something like that. Play a low note and then play a slightly lower note, see if they show any sign of reaction to that slightly different stimulus. Eye tracking is really useful. So you can use machines sitting on a table or sitting on a child's eye, well, on a headgear like this that monitors the eye with little cameras and things to see and track where is a child looking. So if you looked at my eye tracking during the course of a lecture, you'd probably see like a hot spot over here in the chat box. So I'm pointing towards the chat box. You'd see me glancing over to the lecture slides, looking towards the little area specifically where I will see hands being raised. So you can do that with the child too and see what are they paying attention to. Do they first look at humans' eyes? Do they first look at the green block or the red block? Those kinds of things. So from what we can tell, it seems like this is the vision at about 1 month old, 2 months old, 3 months old, and 1 year old of an infant. So at about 6 months, it seems they have about 20/40 vision, which I think better than my vision. I forget what my actual numbers are. I just know what my contact prescription is so I can buy new contacts. But yeah, that's about what eyes are developing from. And it makes sense because in prenatal development, the eyes can sense the light or dark, but there's not really shapes to look at. There's not additional colors to look at. So after birth, the eyes are starting to get new sensations and new perceptions, and the eyes and the brain are learning how to process those images. So this is how that visual development is probably what it appears for a child. Also, they're very nearsighted. They can see things really close to their face better than further away. So additionally, it's really hard for them to perceive things that are occluded, like behind objects like this, until after about 2 months, and they still have trouble tracking objects. Depth perception seems to come at at about 4 months old. So younger than 4 months, if you put them here on this visual cliff, they will probably just crawl straight out. After about that time, they probably won't, because hopefully at home they've noticed, hey, if I kind of tip off the couch, I get scared and I'm starting to fall, that kind of thing. So learning to explore their environment helps with this kind of sensation and perception. This video of essentially this and other similar experiments. They're pretty interesting, but we don't have time to go over them together, so feel free to watch them on your own. So fetuses in the last 2 months can hear sounds in the womb. They may be able to recognize patterns in sound, especially human speech. So it seems like even in the womb, they're getting attuned and they're processing and getting ready for further on developing language abilities, but being able to hear this kind of pitch and the timbre and the way humans speak. Yeah. With that, it is really hard for infants to hear, to sense and perceive soft sounds. So even though with a really newborn baby, you might want to be whispering and talking to it really quietly, it can actually be helpful to talk a little bit louder. Don't yell at the baby, obviously. That's not what I'm saying, but talking in a more normal voice rather than the whisper can actually be a little better, because then they're able to sense and perceive that sound. Physical development in childhood, I'm kind of going to skim through this. Feel free to definitely read through the chapter on this in more detail, but in lecture we can't go into a ton of detail at this time. Growth is slowing as opposed to in infancy, so it's not as quick, but it is still quite fast. So about 2.5 inches a year and 5 to 7 pounds a year. Girls are only slightly smaller on average until puberty, so they're pretty similar in height. Bodies are lengthening during this time. So that's why none of my daughter's pants fit, because they're all too short, because her body's getting really, really long. So that's why you got to buy pants all the time. With that, most body variations that you see in young children, so early childhood, if you remember, goes about to age 6. So body variations are generally due to genetics in children, but depending on their nutrition, it can adjust it slightly. But so the bigger portion of the variance is coming from genes at this point. Brain development has a really big effect on cognitive development, essentially all throughout life. So the brain is still developing. After age 2, the overall size isn't changing much. We're getting more of those dendrites and axon connections, so it's getting heavier and denser, but there's not like additional pieces added onto the brain after that. Myelination happens, as well as those axons. So with that, children who are living in low-income situations, that's correlated to less density in the brain, so less of those connections, and maternal sensitivity is correlated to more density in the neurons. So this is an example of a risk factor. So it's one potential thing that could be a risk to future cognitive development, learning as quickly as they could if they had more connections in their brains. But maternal sensitivity is what we call a protective factor. So a mother who's more sensitive to the needs of the child. And I would guess a lot of research on children and their caregiver usually is the child and mother, but I would guess that this would hold true for any primary caregiver, whether it's a grandparent or a father or the mother. So that sensitivity to the primary caregiver is correlated to more density in the neurons. So the more quick and, well, not necessarily quick, the more responsive and accurate the responses of the caregiver, being sensitive to the needs of that child will help teach the child in different ways that allows them to make more neural connections. So risk factor, low income, could be overcome by this protective factor of maternal sensitivity. So 2 examples there. One of them might be a cascade or a Plinko peg that knocks a child more towards potential negative outcomes in the future. The other, a protective factor, knocks them back towards more positive outcomes. So trying to balance these, trying to encourage more maternal sensitivity or training for more maternal sensitivity, those kinds of things can help. Give more protective factors to all the kids. So the prefrontal cortex is growing dramatically in early childhood. So there's more dendrites being created there, more myelination there. Before age 2, in a lot of ways, the brain development kind of starts here and moves up to here, as well as myelination from there and moves up to the prefrontal cortex. So if you remember, what does the prefrontal cortex do? Does anyone have a hand to raise or a comment to put in the chat box about what the prefrontal cortex does? All right, yep, impulse control is one of them. Yeah, very good, Adam. Thank you. And thanks for your earlier thumbs up. Making goals, yep. So as this is developing, as there are more connections made in the prefrontal cortex, this child in early childhood is getting better at impulse control, probably while they're learning impulse control, making goals as they're making goals. So these are important skills to be developing at this time, and it's related to both the socio-emotional development of someone teaching them or having the opportunities to play and make goals and control their impulses when they want to steal their brother's toys, as well as the biological development of the connections of the neurons. So yeah, really great. Thank you, Adam and Shay. Great work. Here we can see in different areas of the brain where synapses are being pruned. So you can see there's a lot of synapses, and then at about age 1 in the visual cortex, there starts to be pruning. So the dendrites and axon branches being kind of reabsorbed up into the neuron. So visual cortex, that pruning starts pretty early, but for a lot of children, it's early on in early childhood. So closer to around 3 years. The prefrontal cortex and auditory cortex have essentially their most connections, and then they start pruning, keeping the ones that are most relevant to what the child is doing and what the child is learning. If you did more things to work on their auditory cortex, they would gain more connections in that area. Say if they started doing music classes or singing classes or something like that, or learning multiple languages. I do wonder if children who, at about 3 years, they'll probably be already bi or trilingual if they're learning those languages. So I bet you would still see a drop off of the connections there, but I wonder if it would be as dramatic in someone who only speaks one language. Good question for a question paper. It's probably one I would do after today's class. If I have time, I think I will look that up actually. So with that, gross motor development is still happening at this time. At this point, think of like preschoolers in the age. So by about that time, they should be able to run around pretty well, should be hopping, should be able to play games together. So with that, if children are not meeting these gross motor skill milestones, they're not going to have as much social interaction with friends, for example. So if there's a child who can't run around and chase each other, they're probably going to be left out of games. That doesn't let them have as many socio-emotional opportunities, those kinds of things. So the motor development is related to socio-emotional development. Fine motor skills, age 3 are still pretty low. So a 3-year-old probably couldn't make this set of Legos. A 4-year-old, they're more precise. If they're practicing Legos, for example, specifically, they probably could about this time. And then at 5, they're pretty highly coordinated, should be able to do things like writing, for example. So we're jumping quite a bit further forward now, all the way into adolescence and puberty. So I really want to focus on one main topic of neural development in puberty. After that, we might jump straight to some socio-emotional development and jump back to childhood. But let's talk about puberty and neural development in adolescence. So puberty occurs between about the ages of, or starts to happen between the ages of about 9 to 16, and the start of that is programmed into our genes. As you can see here, this is the average onset time and the average completion time, but then there's kind of a standard deviation around that. So generally, the first thing that, say, a parent might notice in a child or peers might notice in a female would be breast growth. For males, should be the next slide, it will generally be, probably not peers, obviously, would be testicular development, would be one of the first signs of the onset of puberty. And you can see where these tend to change. So you can see some of these have a real big, for example, the average onset of breast growth for a female is about the age of 11, but it might not, the onset of breast growth might not happen closer to the age of 18. So these kinds of differences for any individual are going to change how they're interacting with peers as well. So with this, the average age of the beginning of menarche, which is the first period, and menstrual cycle have been decreasing over the last decades. So it's now quite a few years earlier than it was a couple decades ago and centuries ago as well. So for those girls who are going through puberty really early, so let's say 12, 13, when they're starting to show signs of physical development, when they're starting menarche, that time, how might that affect the socio-emotional lives of those girls as opposed to girls who are starting these processes closer to 16 or 17? So that's their physical development is beginning their period, maybe starting the development of breast growth and these other aspects of puberty, primary and secondary sexual characteristics. So if it's happening closer to 13 versus 16, what might you see in socio-emotional development? So raging hormones, probably crying a lot. So yeah, if you're going through puberty already, you might have more hormone changes at this time, or you would be having more hormone changes. So you might be crying a lot. You might be more emotional than your peer who's maybe 16 and not having that. Yeah. Any other things you might see in peer groups in the person developing at 13 versus 16 or 17? Yep, hair growth in both legs, armpits. Yeah, for sure. So going back to these, we've got growth of pubic hair specifically, but other areas of hair like armpits are happening about that same time. So for that, there are these visual, like to other people seeing a person, there are these visual markers that someone's entered puberty. So with that, early maturing girls tend to be more likely to smoke, drink, and have eating disorders. They tend to also have early dating and sexual experiences. There are a lot more risk factors for early maturing girls than early maturing boys. So for early maturing girls, unfortunately, it seems a lot of times their peer groups of their own age, so the other 13-year-olds or other 14-year-olds, tend to be more rejective towards those girls who are going through puberty first, as opposed to boys who are going through puberty first tend to have a higher social status. They're seen as, oh, they're getting more manly, so they're cool. That's cool. Versus in the groups of girls, these early maturing girls are often ostracized, which leads to other socio-emotional factors like hanging out with people who are a little older than them, a little more matured with physically, maybe even developmentally, cognitively, so and socio-emotionally. So if a 13-year-old girl is hanging out with 18-year-old girls, there's more likely to have these kinds of things happening. So early maturation is higher correlation. This double-sided arrow you can also generally think of as correlation. So early maturation for girls tends to have worse outcomes. Late maturation for boys tends to have worse outcomes. So boys who have, say, a higher pitched voice or haven't developed physical characteristics, like haven't had a growth spurt yet, those kinds of things, and they're 18 or even 19, they will tend to be more ostracized, versus if that growth spurt is happening closer to 15 for the boys and they're the first one in their social group to have that happen, their status will be higher. So there's a lot more socio-emotional things that we could talk about and how in group dynamics there, but we definitely don't have time. With the time we have, let's watch this video on brain development in adolescence, and then we'll be able to take a break before we jump back to socio-emotional development in childhood and talk about attachment. While we're on the break, after this video, make sure if you have a microphone, you go and grab it so you're ready so you can talk to a group, because we'll do an activity with groups. So make sure you have devices ready so you can do that. All right, so let's watch this about neural development first in adolescence and around puberty specifically.
And so is living with one, I'm told. Being a teenager is hard, and so is living with one, I'm told. No human gets to escape this moody, angsty, confusing phase, and interestingly, such an extended adolescence is unique to humans. Other animals grow up a lot faster. You may think our teen years are just about streamlining bodies for baby making, but as it turns out, the storms of sex hormones that we associate with the teenage years are only a small part of what's really going on in the teenage body. Most of the action, it turns out, is happening in the brain. Until fairly recently, we thought that the brain finished the nuts and bolts of its development by the time we started kindergarten. But really, right as puberty rolls in, it undergoes massive remodeling. This amounts to several years of neural growing pains, as well as the other more visible growth that's going on all over your body. So take heart, whether you're going through it now, or about to go through it, or count yourself among the veterans of that turbulent decade. Know that the result of the teen years is a stronger, faster, more sophisticated brain. Someone had told me that 20 years ago. Let's start with that obvious scapegoat of adolescent anguish, hormones. That word itself is kind of a lazy shorthand that people use to describe the chemicals that some of our glands excrete that can affect our behavior. But the fact is, hormones have all kinds of jobs that have nothing to do with where you grow hair, or what turns you on, or whether you feel glum for no apparent reason. Hormones keep your heart beating and your body hydrated, and they make your organs grow and make you grow bone and muscle and skin. What people actually mean when they talk about teenage hormones are sex hormones. And yes, puberty involves a whole series of sex hormone storms, the first of which actually kicks in before you're out of primary school. That's when the adrenal glands start secreting androgens, which trigger the growth and activity of the skin's sebaceous glands, making skin more oily. Soon enough, more apocrine get activated, increasing body odor. Then comes the wave of hormonal agents that start activating the gonads. For boys, this influx of luteinizing hormones from the pituitary gland get testosterone brewing in the testes, and suddenly that guy has up to 50 times more testosterone than he did before puberty. This also changes the shape of the male body, promoting hair growth and building up lean muscle mass, just as the increased presence of estrogen in girls rearranges the deposition of their fat, stimulating the growth of breasts. Humans are actually lucky to experience the craziness of puberty only once. Many other animals undergo multiple similarly intense hormonal rodeos as they enter sexually active periods, sometimes called the rut or heat, every new breeding season. Some male species completely stop eating during their breeding period because they're just that sex crazed. And yet, all that said, teens are far less ruled in their hormones than you might think. There are other factors at play here. For example, your favorite moody teen may be by turns punchy, angry, depressed, or in a zombie-like fog because of their chronic lack of sleep. Sleep is vital to everyone, but it's especially important for kids and teens because it's during sleep that you're
I feel like that was actually too fast, so sorry about that. So some of the main points that have been hit on so far that I just want to reiterate are that the hormones that we usually talk about in relation to puberty aren't only affecting sex and sexual characteristics. So there are other things happening in the brain that are affecting how individuals in adolescence going through puberty are going to be behaving. One of them is sleep, and sleep can have a really big impact on neural development and socio-emotional and group interactions, things like that.
The pituitary gland releases an essential growth hormone necessary for development. A normal sleep cycle driven by circadian rhythm is regulated by the daytime release of cortisol, which helps you wake up, and melatonin, which helps you wind down when it gets dark. But this biology of sleep timing changes as we age, and as puberty begins, teens' sleep clocks get pushed back. Most adults start oozing melatonin around 10 p.m.-ish, but one study showed that teenagers don't start producing melatonin until closer to 1 a.m. This may be because puberty's hormonal frenzy is stalling the release of melatonin, and could partly explain why so many teens stay up late, energized by the night, but have a really hard time rolling out of bed with the alarm. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg deal, since watching reruns of The Simpsons and playing Call of Duty late into the night continues to stimulate the brain, which may further delay the release of melatonin. Still, some researchers are starting to advocate for pushing back high school start times in the morning in the hopes of having more focused students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies.
So we'll pause right there really quick. Let's talk about sleep and that chronic lack of sleep just briefly. So I like to kind of get an assessment of who thinks they had the earliest high school start time in the class. So if you think you had the earliest start time, just put it in the chat box. We'll see what the earliest is. So that's the actual like high school start time. Like I had marching band one of the years of school, and that was before school. So that was like an hour earlier. So not that, just like the general everybody in school start time. Some people did have classes before that and whatnot. So mine wasn't as bad as it could have been. My high school start time was 8:25 now. I see a couple comments here, 7:30 as a start time. So as it said there, anybody earlier than 7:30, first of all, which I am sorry, that is awful. 7:30, 7:45, that is really bad for an adolescent brain. As it says there, adolescent brains just naturally should be waking up a lot closer to 9 o'clock. So if you're forcing yourself to wake up, forcing yourself to start and think, interact with people, do school, this leaves you a lot more tired in a lot of cases. So one of the reasons that school is set at this time is because it's actually really close to what middle adulthood sleep schedules are. So in middle adulthood, so the timing of a lot of the teachers and administrators, they're waking up earlier than an adolescent would be just generally without like setting alarm, just the body's natural circadian rhythms. So that's why school is set to that time. So is there a way that we can change school to be better for both the adolescents and fit with the schedules of their teachers and administrators? I think there probably are. And it's probably not starting school at 7:30 or earlier. Yeah, 7:30 that's awful. But also, this is one reason that that adolescents sleep or go to sleep so late as well. So melatonin is being produced later on in the brain. So, but if you combine that with also playing video games late into the night, for example, having to wake up really early, it can lead to really poor quality of sleep. And if you're getting that your entire 4 years of high school, entire years of college, it can be really detrimental in your cognitive development. So think about what your body needs essentially, especially now that you can in some ways pick at least your classes when your classes are going to be. You might not be able to pick your work. Your work might have you coming in at 6 a.m., for example. So as much as you can, it'd be great if we could pick our own schedules as well as create a society that's good for the development of people.
Students. So we got sex hormones changing the bodies and a lack of sleep to contend with, but increasing evidence suggests that there is something much bigger at work that's making teenagers so teenagery. Their brains. It turns out that brains actually take longer than we thought to fully mature. I don't mean physical size. Our brains are already about 95% full size by the time we're just 6, but more in the sense of the connections inside the brain. Adults, for the most part, know how to make decisions by evaluating choices and weighing consequences. They do this with their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for controlling impulses and emotions and forming judgments. Its neurons chat with the neurons in other regions of the brain responsible for, say, memory or movement through synapses. Thing is, teenage brains don't quite work like this yet. The prefrontal cortex may not be fully developed until your mid-20s, and teen synapses, those lines of communication, are still growing and specializing. They're also slow. As an adolescent brain keeps developing, its axons, the long tail-like parts of the neurons that transmit signals to other neurons, become more and more insulated by a fatty layer called the myelin sheath. This padding greatly increases the cell's transmission speed, and while it helps adults make faster decisions, it isn't fully formed in teens. These changes occur slowly, beginning at the back of the brain, where the oldest and most fundamental brain parts reside, and slowly working its way forward to the more advanced and complicated brain bits. The prefrontal cortex is the last to be hooked up and shaped. So it's important to keep in mind that just because your favorite teenagers stayed up until sunrise binge watching The Walking Dead the night before an exam, it doesn't mean they're dumb or lazy. Their brains are just literally finishing being built. But at the same time, because all this brain building is just starting to peak, this is also when the brain starts getting thinned out. You actually start losing connection.
So before this point, I definitely want to reemphasize one of the first things that's finishing myelinating in adolescence is the emotion centers of the brain. So as well as feeling, having those hormones, creating stronger feelings, the brain, because it's able to process emotions faster, a lot of adolescents are literally feeling more emotions and emotions stronger than they have at any other point of their life. So their emotion center of the brain is pretty much fully formed at about that time, but their prefrontal cortex and some of those inhibitions are not fully formed. So this can lead to a lot of risk-taking behavior and things like that. So he'll go into that as well here. But with our time, I think we'll actually stop the video there. It is a really good video. I do encourage you to watch the rest of it, but we'll go through the next couple slides and I'll talk about some of these points, but we won't actually watch them together. So this center, the limbic system with the emotion center, it's finishing developing, it's finishing that myelination at that time. So adolescents are feeling emotions stronger, they're feeling more emotions in a wider variety, more than they ever have at any time in their life. So with that, later in adolescence, other neurons and into early adulthood, the neurons in the prefrontal cortex are going to finish their myelination. So essentially that area of the brain will kind of catch up at that point at about age 23. And so then with these things like emotion regulation, empathy, insight, those will be caught up to the limbic system of the brain, which is where a lot of our emotions, a lot of our rewards come from. So this is one reason adolescents are so likely to do more risk-taking behaviors, because they don't have all of these things like emotion regulation and and inhibitions fully formed yet. So they might want to try additional drugs or more risky activities. I know after adolescence, I wasn't trying to do as many like skateboard or snowboard tricks. Still did a lot of parkour, even into now, honestly, which, but I definitely did take more risks in adolescence than I did later on in life. And that's one of the reasons why. So this is another example of that biological development influencing socio-emotional development and being related to that cognitive development as well. So we will kind of skip over some of the other physical changes. We might come back to this biological theories of aging. If we don't, definitely watch this video on telomeres, about how cells essentially start to die in the body and how it's kind of systematic. We're going to take a quick break right now, and then we'll come back and we will talk about specifically, I do want to talk about that. We're going to talk about temperament, so start really early on in child with socio-emotional development. Hopefully we do have time to come back to that whole section of cognitive development I just skipped. But I do want to get into our activity today and talk about attachment. So right now, let's have a break. Be back in the general classroom at 4:07. And then we'll continue talking about the socio-emotional development starting at childhood. And we're back. So let's jump into socio-emotional development. Hopefully anybody who does have microphones was able to find that and get that ready or get it set up to work with their computer on the break. Because one of the things that we're going to talk about is attachment, and we're going to have kind of a lab sort of activity on attachment. So let's start off with very early on in infancy. So in infancy, temperament is something that you could think of as the personality of an infant. So temperament is the differences in behavioral styles, emotions, and characteristic way of responding. So it's kind of infant personality. So there are more of these. The original classifications were easy, difficult, and slow to warm up child. There are more classifications now, but we're going to focus on these. So easy child is essentially a child that, an infant again, that's generally in a positive mood, that establishes routines really quickly and easily, and is able to adapt to life changes or new routines really easily. So this would be a child that's generally pretty positive. You can get a really good sleep schedule going. If you go to grandma's for the weekend, they really quickly get onto their same or a new sleep schedule, even though it might be different. So that's easy child. Difficult child is more generally reacting negatively, will probably be crying more frequently, has very irregular daily routines. So one day they might nap from 9 to 2, and next day they might only nap from like noon to 1. So a lot of irregularity, not a lot of consistency in their daily routines, which can be difficult for a parent to have that kind of change day by day in that kind of routine. So this is why people and researchers named it a difficult child. And then this is one of the big key differences here, is that they're slow to adapt to changes. So this child, you take the child to grandma's house for the weekend. They probably won't establish the new sleeping schedule there at grandma's. It'll be hard days the whole time you're there, and so it's just frustrating and more stressful. And so hopefully you can see from these comments that I'm making that a child, an infant with an easy temperament is probably more likely to get some more positive interactions with caregivers, versus a difficult child will probably have more negative interactions than the easy child would. Not necessarily that the difficult child will always only have negative interactions, because they'll have a lot of positive too. But that might lead to different other behaviors, right? So, and then the slow to warm up child is kind of, I think the best way to describe this in really briefly is kind of a boring child, which sounds terrible, but it's a really easy way to describe these kinds of behaviors. So generally a lower activity level, the infant's not going to be doing too much, somewhat negative, but a very low intensity of mood. So they might have regular routines, they might not have regular routines. They just kind of are lower intensity in their mood and their interactions or their reactions. So those are the three different temperaments that we're going to talk about. And this is then related to how the later socio-emotional development of the children. So this is related to attachment, and attachment is related to a lot of things. So if you remember from the textbook, what is the relevance of this monkey in this picture? What's going on here? What did we learn from this monkey and this study? So feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat. So the monkey is attached to the blanket and it comforts it. So good way to summarize that. So in this study, they had this is essentially a mother surrogate. So a mother monkey with a soft blanket, and it generally had a light bulb in it, so it was a little warmer. And then another monkey like this, except it was just a wire. And on that monkey, it has nipples for milk. So the monkey could get nutrients from, so the actual live animal monkey I'm talking about here could get nutrients and feed on the wire mother, and this soft terry cloth mother had this blanket on it and was a little warmer. So, and you're absolutely right, Adam, that it was more comforting to it. So the monkeys actually spent more time on the soft mother. And this was a little surprising to the researchers. They wanted to see, well, which mother would they spend more time on? Before this, it was thought that a lot of the basic motivation for food would drive that kind of attachment to the wire mother figure. But in reality, the monkeys were more attached to this warm and more comforting mother. And so this is actually really similar to humans. You can actually see these graphs. This is, I believe, in your textbook too, this graph of the hours they spent with the wire versus cloth mother. So attachment is that close emotional bond between an infant or any person, but in this context, let's not make it confusing yet. Attachment is that close bond between the infant and their caregiver. Usually these studies are looking at the primary caregiver, which is usually mother in these studies, but there have been attachment studies with father, so there have been attachment studies with grandparents and as the primary caregiver. But most studies in development and the primary caregiver are usually the mother. Like some of my colleagues at CGU, they are in infant attachment labs, and so they do some of the studies that with a strange situation that we're going to show in a second. And so they're always putting out calls for participants. They're like, hey, if you are the mother of a child that's 3 and under, come and spend an hour in our lab and we'll give you $60. I'm like, well, hey, I could come into your lab. I know where it is. I could just, in between classes, I can bring my kid. They're that age. They always said no, though, because I wasn't the mother. So I gave them a hard time about it. But a lot of the research is on mothers rather than fathers. But it's getting better. Still can do more, though. My point is, attachments to a primary caregiver. So this is the phases of the development of that attachment. And honestly, for our purposes now, attachment develops over time. It's not like an immediate thing. And the way that we are attached and how we are attached changes over time too. So as a pretty dramatic example, the attachment to our mother or that primary caregiver is, if it's a secure attachment, that will actually be what we tend to seek out in a romantic partner later in life, is a secure attachment. So that relationship with that partner is obviously a lot different than a relationship with the primary caregiver, but that secure attachment, looking for someone who you can rely on and be a sounding board, be a safe place to come back to, that kind of secure attachment part of it is one example of how attachment develops over time. So attachment is generally measured through the strange situation. So hopefully you remember this from your reading. I've got a couple visual examples. It's essentially an observational measure to monitor some interactions with a parent and an infant, or a parent and a young child, and a stranger and a young child, to see and observe the child's behaviors, code it for, does it look like that's securely attached? Does it look like that's insecure? And then what kind of secure or insecure? So this is essentially what happens. You bring a child and the parent in this case, mother, so I might use parent or mother interchangeably here. So the child and the mother come into the room, they play with toys that might be there, read books, whatever. And the nice thing about this is you can do it in a lab. You can have it on your campus, essentially, have a room set up, have cameras set up so that you can observe these interactions over the course of, say, 15 minutes to up to the course of an hour. And with that, you can get a really good assessment of the attachment between the child and the caregiver. So you can do the same thing by going to the home of the parent and the child, but then you've got to think as a researcher, yeah, I could go out to 60 people's homes and watch their interactions with the child, see their attachment and how they behave, or I could bring 60 people to the lab, sit in my comfy office chair, watch these videos, or watch them through a double pane mirror while I'm sipping my coffee. So just logistically, it's easier, and you get some good valid data by doing the strange situation. So back to what it is. You bring the child and the mother in, and then a stranger comes in after some time. The parent leaves, and so the child is left with a stranger. So you can watch, well, what was their interaction with the child at the beginning? Was there a lot of interaction? Was there not very much? Did the child play close by the parent, further away from the parent? Then you watch to see, what does the child do when the parent leaves? Is the child really, really upset? Can they be comforted by the stranger? Does the child not care at all that the parent's gone now? And then what happens when the parent returns? Does the child calm down quickly? Are they not able to calm down? Does the child now keep exploring the room compared to their previous behavior, or do they stay close to the parent and not explore like they did before? And then oftentimes the child's left alone entirely, and the stranger might return rather than the parent. So watching those different interactions, what does the child do at any of these given stages in relation to the parent, in relation to the stranger, in relation to this room, this strange situation? But in some ways, it's similar to a parent bringing a child to a preschool and dropping them off, right? Or bringing a child to a babysitter and dropping them off. So it is similar to some actual real life situations. It's kind of just made in a way that's a little unusual, so we can get this data about their attachment quickly. So what are the attachment styles? One is secure attachment. So in secure attachment, the child is going to use that caregiver as a secure base. So when they get to this room, the child will be more likely to go and play with toys. If they're securely attached, if they're, say, over here, they might look back towards the parent or go ask the parent if they can go play with something further away. But the parent is a secure place to come back to. They'll explore that room. They might cry when the parent leaves, but when the parent comes back, they can usually quickly establish positive interactions with that caregiver again. They might cry the whole time the parent's gone, but once the parent comes back, they can quickly be positively interacting with that caregiver, and they will most often go back to playing again. So that's how you can tell a secure attachment. The child knows that they can rely on that parent for things that they need. When the parent's there, they can go and talk to the parent. They can get things that they need from the parent and then go off and do the things that they want to do. Insecure avoidant is a lot of insecurity with avoiding the caregiver. So when they're in the room playing, they might not really be interacting with the caregiver. They might seem really the child might seem really independent. They don't seem to be really to care when the caregiver leaves. When the caregiver comes back, they might not even pay attention. They might even look away or try not to interact with the caregiver when they come back. So this child knows they can't rely on that parent for their needs to be met. So they're avoiding that caregiver. They're avoiding that contact. It doesn't seem to faze them when they leave, probably because they can't rely on the parent when they're there anyway, so it doesn't matter if the parent's gone. And that's kind of sad, right? This is this insecure avoidant attachment style is a risk predictor for a lot of negative outcomes later in life. Insecure resistant is a little bit different. So when coming into this new room, they might be clingy to the caregiver, but they also might resist that closeness. So you might see both behaviors from one individual. So being really clingy at first, and then after a little bit, just seemingly wanting to push away from the caregiver. Not that they want to explore necessarily, but that they're just kind of don't feel like they can trust the caregiver. They will generally cry really loudly and be very distressed when the caregiver leaves. But then when the caregiver comes back, they won't be able to calm down very easily. So insecure resistant seems to be like they sometimes get their needs met from the caregiver, but they know they can't always rely on it. So they're fearful about that. They want to grab onto the caregiver, but they also might want to push them away because they don't feel like they can trust them. So you can imagine how that life might be like for that insecure, resistant child. It might be a little more difficult than one with a secure attachment who has a secure base of a secure caregiver to go back to and get support from and then go off into the world to explore. All right, insecure, disorganized exists, and there's other categories too that exist now. There's more updated categories. Today, insecure, disorganized is kind of where they originally lumped everything else that didn't fit these other categories, the secure, insecure, avoidant, and insecure resistant. Now it's been broken up into more categories, but the videos we're going to watch in attachment styles, None of them are insecure or disorganized, so you can just kind of ignore this one, but it does exist. So why is attachment important? Why am I mentioning it in relation to romantic relationships later on in life? Because a lot of times our socio-emotional development, or in a lot of ways, our socio-emotional development start in that core secure attachment environment. And if you don't have that secure attachment, a lot of things can be harder. So it's a risk factor, like I said, for other potential developmental challenges or building strong relationships with peers and friends, and then romantic partners later on. So Karina mentioned you have RAD, so is reactive attachment disorders. I think that the synonym there, or that's not synonym. Okay, perfect. Is there anything that you would like to share about it, and how any additional information? Because in the class, we're really only talking about secure, insecure, avoidant, and insecure resistant. Do you want to make additional comments?
Can you hear me? Am I heard this time?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. So it kind of just made me think of, it's a mixture of a lot of those different attachments together. So it is reactive attachment disorder, and what it is for me exactly is I don't let people get very close to me. Like I hold my hand up, and then I do certain things that I know is going to affect them, and then when they leave, it's more of like I knew that was going to happen. But if they do happen to get past that and they're still there, then I happen to attach and make that connection and not want to let go, and it could break me more. That's kind of how I can explain that.
Yeah, thank you very much for explaining in that way. I think that firsthand experience is really valuable for everybody to get a lot clearer picture about how it affects life. Because I'm sure this is related to your friendships, romantic relationships, even family relationships, work relationships, all those kinds of things.
All of them. Every relationship you can have, even with your pets. It's really weird.
Oh, interesting. I don't know why. I had never even considered that connection to pets, so non-human friendships that you might have. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you sharing that. But it's a really good example for everybody about how these attachment styles that start off in early life are related to our future socio and emotional development. So thank you again for that. I feel like, no, we'll definitely do the activity. It makes me think of some of the topics that we'll cover in a little bit after this. But I feel like we can call back to this example that Karina gave us later on as well. So essentially these socio-emotional relationships, well, no, I'll go into that point now. I might not be able to find the slide really quickly for it. So while these attachments do tend to be the same our entire life, they can change. So for example, someone who with their caregiver has an insecure avoidant attachment style, that will tend to be the attachment style that they will try to seek out in, say, a romantic partner. So also friendships, things like that, like Karina was mentioning. So insecure avoidant, you can imagine how maybe two insecure avoidant people coming together in a relationship, trying to have a romantic relationship, might be more difficult, right? Than two people who had a secure attachment in childhood and become securely attached to each other. That's going to be a lot more easy to navigate maybe challenges or jealousy or troubles that come up versus insecure avoidant. That's going to be a lot more difficult for those two people. But that being said, while about 75% of people keep their same attachment style throughout life, about 25, it is changeable. So on average, most people don't change their attachment style, but it is something that is changeable, which I think is an optimistic thing in development. As an example, because we're using the dating example, but this works for friends. So let's use friends now as an example. So let's say you become friends with someone, even though you're insecurely avoidantly attached or any other insecure attachment. And that friend, they grew up with a secure attachment to their caregiver. This person becomes your best friend. You can actually change your attachment style and learn how to be securely attached to that person, and then now have a securely attached attachment style the rest of your life. So generally for most people, this changes in late adolescence or early adulthood, but it can also change if, say, a child is adopted to a family where they now have a secure attachment style. So while 75% of people do keep their same attachment style through life, it is something that can change. And so, yeah, it's, I think, a good, useful thing. Oh, interesting. So I wonder, I don't know if you have any kind of attachment assessments for before you're adopted versus after you're adopted, or what age, Karina, but that's interesting. If you want to say more about that and these comments I'm making now, feel free. If not, that's okay too.
No, it's all right. I was 8 when I was adopted, and so I was in 17 foster homes in 4 years from the age of 2 to 6. I kind of got to the point where even being a 6-year-old, when I'd go to a new house, I'd just walk in like I knew what was going on. Like I didn't have that kind of connection. It was everyone leaves, everyone comes, I'm just here for the night. And I had an older sister actually who was with me most of the time, and she was more of the very pulled back and clung to just me. She didn't want to talk to anybody. It took a while for her to open up and make any connections with like our foster homes. And I just go right into it, acting like it was someone, I just knew. Same thing when I got adopted as well. But I think that's my mechanism to kind of make myself not vulnerable, not to have that connection, is to just make it seem like I'm just so willing for a relationship and, hey, hi, how are you? But I don't let it get too deep.
So more surface level with these people, like you know who they are, but not maybe they don't know much about you, and you might not actually know much about them.
Right.
Interesting. Great. Thank you for sharing that. That's really relevant, super relevant to this point. So with that, let's go back to early childhood and see if we can assess for 2 children. I don't think we'll have time for the 3rd video, but feel free to watch that on your own. We'll watch these couple videos and see if we can, in our groups, determine what kind of attachment style they have. So essentially what we're going to do, I'll show you a video of a interaction in the strange situation between a caregiver and their child and the stranger, and going back and forth. It's obviously cut down for time because these, at their shortest, they're about 15-minute interactions for the whole strange situation. So it's just showing key pieces of it, but watch for specific evidence there. So watch for specific evidence and then jump into your group teams. So if you're in the happiness group, jump into that group meeting room. If you're in the operational learning group, jump into that group. So essentially, your small group will be your discussion group for this topic. If no one else in your group is there, like you show up to that area and no one's there, just jump up to the one above you. So maybe everybody will end up in like groups 1, 2, and 3. How many students do we have right now anyway? We've got 12. So there's definitely students missing. So if everyone's missing, everybody just fill up into groups 1, 2, and 3. So we'll watch a video, then jump over to those rooms after watching the video, and then talk with each other about which attachment style you think it is. Actually, I think with the difficulty of jumping back and forth, we'll watch both videos together as a class. Then I'll let you go to that area. And at that point, you talk about video 1, what attachment style, why, which pieces of evidence did you see, what was the second one, why, which pieces of evidence did you see, and then come back to the main group, and we'll see what everybody decided in their groups. So first, try in your team groups for your presentation, and if no one else in your team is here, jump up to groups 1, 2, and 3, and I'll fill up that. All right, so I'm going to open the video. I'm afraid on YouTube it might show the answer, so I'm going to stop my screen sharing really quick and open up the video, and hopefully you won't see the answer, and we can do that. Oh, why is it not hyperlinking to the video? Well, now I have a problem that I think I might have saved the file inappropriately. So it's not actually going to the video. Oh, there we go. Oh, well, it started to work, and then then my PDF viewer app just closed. So that was not great. Let's see if I can make this work. Come on, I like this activity. Let's work. All right, I think I have to go. Actually, I should be able to open up my, not my PDF version, but my ODP save, and it should be working there, even if it's not working here. Sorry, this is taking a little longer. All right, there we go. I think I found them. Now I'm trying to find the original video on YouTube. I found one of the examples here, so I'll pull that up. It's not edited down to where I usually have it, but this will be good enough for one of the examples. Yeah, so here we go. I will start it playing, and then hopefully, since you'll see the title on YouTube, you won't actually see the attachment style. So while watching this, look for specific pieces of evidence of, is this child securely attached, insecure avoidant, insecure disorganized. Look at the attachment style. Right now I'm feeling not very attached to my computer. Although that's not actually what attachment research is about. Just trying to make a joke and lighten the mood. All right, so I will share my screen now, and let's see what kind of attachment style this is. So we'll watch both videos. Actually, since I need to find the second video, we'll watch this one video, jump into your rooms for 4 minutes to discuss pieces of evidence, and then come back here. Hopefully I will have found the other video. If not, we'll just discuss this one example at that point. So watch for any behaviors that you think look like secure, insecure avoidant, or insecure resistant attachment.
You know how to play? No? Yeah. Play with the car, that's me. You have your buddy? The baby? You love the baby? What's the baby doing? What's the baby doing? You want to take care of him? Like that's to me. Who? Hi, Destiny. 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 Hey, Destiny. You having fun?
All right, hopefully I changed that before it showed the name. So, oh, okay, time to go play. Yeah, we'll do another video in a minute. Hopefully I stopped that before it showed the answer for what kind of attachment style that was. So now jump into the smaller groups. I will look for the next example on YouTube or try to get mine to work. So with that, go to your small groups. Be back in 4 minutes. So at 4:45, 4:46, jump back here. Hopefully you have an answer. Is that secure attachment, insecure avoidant, or insecure disorganized attachment? So go talk to your groups and see. All right. Hopefully everybody is back now. It looks like everyone from Group 6 came back over here. I think Group 6 was the only one we actually had discussing. So I think we may only have you couple students actively here in the lecture, which is a little disheartening. But it seemed like the discussion, even though it's a little bit harder of a format to do text messaging or instant messaging here to talk about it, it looked like you had a pretty good conversation. So it looked like a few of you were thinking that it was secure attachment, and a few of you were thinking that it was insecure avoidant attachment. So anyone who switched their opinion one way or the other, would you like to comment on why you switched your opinion? And either use the chat box or the or turn on your mic. I'm hoping someone's typing because I know a couple of you seem to change your mind on it. While that's being typed, though, I will open up the video in the other window and show you the answer. So it was actually an insecure avoidant attachment style. And so a couple, I think it was Adam pointed out a couple things, and I think Karina pointed out a couple things too about it being an avoidant attachment style. So here is just a part where the stranger has just left. The parent has come back in, the stranger has left, and the child is just not really interacting with their caregiver at all. They're avoiding facial contact. They're not like running away from the caregiver, but they don't seem bothered that the caregiver left. They don't seem bothered that the caregiver came back. They just keep playing all on their own. If you look at other times, even before the child and the parent are interacting, the child and the caregiver are interacting, but there's a lot of times that the child and the caregiver are not really interacting with each other. For a second there, I thought I had my mic muted for this whole time and nobody was hearing anything I was saying, but that wasn't the case. So the child's playing here by themselves, and their play doesn't really change. Their behavior doesn't really change throughout, whether it's the stranger there or whether it's the parent there. They do start playing more with the stranger than they ever really do with the parent. And then we see at the very end, the parent comes in, sits down, and the child doesn't really pay attention. They seem to care more that the stranger just left, the person who was just playing with them immediately before that. So it's an example of insecure avoidant attachment. So there's a lot of different reasons why this child might be insecurely avoidantly attached to their caregiver. It's possible, for example, that their caregiver has to work multiple jobs and has to let the child play by themselves a lot of the time, maybe with a grandparent who just doesn't have the energy to give a lot of direct contact. Maybe even if the parent is home, their primary caregiver, maybe there are so many other children in the household that they can't give a lot of one-on-one attention to this child. Maybe there's a sibling that has special needs that need to be taken care of a lot of the time. So there's a lot of different things within this child's context that might lead to this kind of insecure attachment. It's probably not because of some failure of the parent. Like, I'm not trying to say this parent is bad, but that the situations that the parent and the child are in, these contexts that they're in, for whatever reasons, has led now to an insecurely avoidant attachment for this child. And that'll make it more difficult for the child to create secure attachments with peers in the future, with romantic partners later on in life. So hopefully you can see some of that in this interaction. Is there any, I saw in the group discussion, there was some discussion that the child didn't seem to be avoiding the parent. They were definitely not like running away from the parent, but I hope if you go back through and look at bits of this, you can see there's times when the parent comes to interact with the child that the child kind of is avoiding eye contact, so they might not be physically like moving themselves away, but they're avoiding that contact with the caregiver. You can especially see that here at the end. The caregiver comes and sits down and the child is avoiding that contact. So for whatever reason, this child doesn't feel like they can rely on that parent, that caregiver as a secure base all the time. So it's unfortunate to see. The other example that I couldn't actually find the example on YouTube, I think it may have been taken down, but I did download it at one point, so I'll have to go and grab it off a hard drive and make sure it's ready in more formats than I had it ready in for the next class next time. But it was an example of secure attachment that I thought made a really nice contrast. There are a couple examples of secure attachment I found on YouTube, but in those couple of minutes I couldn't like watch through them to make sure that they actually were secure attachment. Sometimes these videos on attachment style are put up by people who are like doing a school report, and they don't always get it accurate when they say, hey, this is secure attachment. It might not actually be secure attachment. So watch out for that. Hopefully the learning that you find on YouTube is useful. Sometimes people make mistakes. So SciShow tends to be pretty accurate. That's why I oftentimes use it. But let's jump back to the slides. And we do not have a ton of time. This is what the first video was. You can see that part of it. Hopefully, it should actually work. If you've downloaded the slides, if your computer's not being weird, it should actually play the video if you click on it. So you can watch that example. And then there's also a third example in here. Do that on your own. You can watch all the different examples of attachment. With the time we have now, I did want to give time to work in groups. It seems like maybe many members of Group 6 are here, so that would be really good to work with. Next week, next time we are in class, we were going to go over Chapter 11 before your second exam. Chapter 8 is just so packed with things. On the one hand, I'm like, I want to give time to do your groups, and it seems like there is an active group here, so I want to do that, but at the same time I'm like, oh, I really want to say so much more about developmental psychology. But chapter 11 does also have a lot of content, so I don't think that we can go over too much more of this chapter. I'm going to just scan through these slides really quickly to see if there's any other main points that I really definitely want to talk about in lecture time. But I think we're going to move on. Especially since now my slides aren't working at all. So good, the computer's decided for me. We're working in groups now. Oh boy. So for the last bit of class, so basically till 5:20, I encourage you to work in your groups. If your group is not actually here right now, so if the other members on your happiness group or the other groups that we were wanting to join on are not here, send them messages, send them emails. I'll show you in Canvas. Actually, I don't want to do that because that'll show you emails that I've received. Essentially, in Canvas, there's a little icon with a pencil in basically a square is what it looks like. You can compose your own emails and just start typing in a classmate's name. So if you right now go to Teams, so let's say you wanted to go and join the Motivation Theories group, you could come here and put a message in here. Just start a new conversation, say, hey, I'm interested in this group. Who else is here? Or you could also look at who was in these previous meetings. So here you could see maybe Emmanuel was wanting to do this group. So Emmanuel, I'd encourage you to email Rihanna. I know she is not able to be in class today, but she's generally pretty active. So I would definitely encourage you to go onto Canvas and email her. It looks like even her Bruin email is here too. So you could just go to your Gmail and email that, as well as emailing Sandra. Just say, hey, I'm interested in being in your group. Where are you at right now? What can I do? So with this time that I'm giving you to work in your groups, the group members that are here in, for example, the group 6, go for it and have a meeting together. If the rest of your group members are not here, do something towards that group project. So make some slides in this time, read some of those pages in the chapter as a reminder. Where's my files? Group presentations, topics. So if you want to be a member of a group and you haven't read that section in the chapter, I'll pull up those pages right now. And then I'll let you go off into your groups and I'll stop pestering you and let you get that work started. All right, so these are the topics again. So jump into those pages in the book, Emmanuel. So send that email, jump into those pages in the book, read over those, so that you can be ready to work with your group on that. If other group members in, say, the operant conditioning or the happiness group aren't here right now, read through that section or start making slides. Wherever you are with your group, do that. And remember, come back and use this space, these basically classrooms, for meeting rooms. So you can come and meet in Group 6 Cognitive Behavioral Therapy anytime. If it works on Friday to work together, come and meet on Fridays, that kind of thing. Thanks for being here today. Sorry my computer didn't want to do the videos and kept shutting down those things. I apologize for that. It's one of the difficulties that we have when we're relying on technology so much. It doesn't always work. So thank you for being here today. Hopefully you can get some good work done in your groups. Send me emails if you're still confused after watching the video I posted earlier on what to do for this group project. So have a good evening. Also, I will still be here like in the general classroom. I just won't have my video actively on, but I'll still be here. Like if you've got questions, feel free to ask them. I won't be coming like through the different groups to monitor or whatever, but I'll be here if you need questions answered.